Revision of A Christmas Carol, Stave 1, Part 2. So the second half of Chapter 1 really begins to show us at least why Scrooge is going to change, if not yet how he will change. And it all begins when he finally returns to his own rather dark home. And to begin with, Dickens emphasises the fact that Scrooge is not a superstitious or imaginative individual. We've already seen that. This is a practical, rational man of business. He tells us he had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London. And the purpose of this is to emphasise that this is not somebody who is liable to hallucinate or invent things or imagine them, which therefore makes the appearance of Marley's ghost even more surprising. And in fact that appearance occurs almost immediately. As he turns to put the key in the lock of the door, he saw in the knocker not a knocker, but Marley's face. And we get this kind of shocking revelation here. And this face he sees is really sinister. There is a macabre quality to it that is meant to be chilling to the reader. We're meant to be fearful of it just as Scrooge is. Dickens describes how a dismal light kind of hangs about it, and it looked like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. And that simile is particularly important. It has an element of humour about it, but it's intended to emphasise its ghostly and decaying nature. It's worth bearing in mind that the Victorians had no fridges, no freezers, and so anything like shellfish, which is obviously like to go off very quickly, was kept in a cold cellar. But when they did start to go off, lobsters particularly would glow in the dark, that kind of phosphorescent blue, which is the way in fact Marley's face is often depicted, and that was as a result of the photobacteria that was created on them. So the simile also emphasises the kind of ghostly, glowing appearance of the door knocker, as well as suggesting something diseased and decaying, which makes it quite disturbing. And in fact, everything about the language here emphasises its rather spectral nature. He uses the word ghostly twice, describes how it is perfectly motionless, the colour is livid, and it appears to be horrible. So all of these terms build up a sense of unease and a sense of fear that we are meant to share with Scrooge. Of course, Scrooge being Scrooge attempts, at least, to dismiss the entire apparition as soon as it returns to the form of a door knocker. He walks straight in, he even says pooh pooh and closes the door with a bang, as if trying to shake off the vision he has seen. We are told, however, he did pause and he did look cautiously about him. So there is a sense of growing uncertainty in Scrooge, which is then shared with the reader. Most significantly, the sound of the door banging is said to have resounded through the house like thunder, a simile that conveys its almost monumental sound that seems to crash through the house, which in turn emphasises how silent and dismal the place is. And in fact, every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appear to have a separate peal of echoes of its own, conveying the way that crash kind of works its way through the house in a rather disturbing way. And particularly the reference to a peal of echoes, which reminds us of bells, like a peal of bells, is going to be important, because bells in fact are symbolically important throughout this novel. They are a symbol of passing time, but also they signal the appearance of each one of the spirits, and here perhaps they are therefore the signal for the appearance of the very first ghost, which is Marley's. Worse still, as Scrooge ascends the staircase towards his own apartment, he thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom, a really haunting vision that presages or foreshadows the appearance of the ghost. And of course the reference to a hearse also has connotations of death. It's a vehicle used to transport coffins, usually to or from a funeral. And so all of this alludes to the sense that this is going to be something rather sinister, disturbing, is going to happen any moment. And when Scrooge finally does enter his apartment, it's dark, partly at least because darkness is cheap and Scrooge liked it, reminding us of his miserly nature, but also enhancing the sense of tension and fear. And although he tries to dismiss everything he has seen, there is a sense of Scrooge himself being uncertain. We're told he locked himself in, double locked himself in, which was not his custom. One of the important things about Scrooge is that he doesn't like change. He keeps going in the same routine, in the same way, day in, day out. So this very slight change not only suggests his anxiety, but also perhaps the potential he has for change in the future. And he then hunts around the room. He looks, there's nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa. A small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in the dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. And the repetition there of nobody and the list of things that Scrooge is checking likewise create a sense of nervous apprehension, of suspense. He is worried. Something is not right here, and he is searching his own apartment to see what that might be. Of course, what the repetition also emphasises is Scrooge's isolation. He lives alone. There is nobody there, and that also potentially makes him vulnerable, enhancing the sense of building terror that is occurring throughout this chapter. He then sits down to his gruel by the fireplace and tries again to dismiss what he has seen. But instead of the faces that he would normally see, such as the Queen of Sheba's, Cain's and Abel's, in the tiles, all he can think of is the face of Marley, 7 years dead. So already that image haunting him, as it will literally come to haunt him at any moment. And this growing unease comes to a kind of climax when he sees a bell begin to swing. We're told it swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. And sound and noise is increasingly important in this chapter. Here, the bells have a kind of funereal quality, as well as being a sign of the approaching spirit. There is a sense of dread in the way in which they suddenly begin to peal around the house. And then we have the clanking noise of some person dragging a heavy chain. And this section is full of onomatopoeic verbs. So we have clanking, dragging chains, a booming sound. And then the noise gets much louder, beginning in the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. And that list suggests the very swift progress of this spectral being as it approaches Scrooge's very room, again building a sense of tension. And then finally it comes through the heavy door and past into the room before his eyes, and with a kind of shocking exclamatory statement, Scrooge shouts, "I know him, Marley's ghost." And of course this, by this point, is not a surprise to the reader, but Scrooge, who has repeatedly denied what he has already seen with his own eyes, is surprised, is shocked, and is kind of overcome by what he sees, because Marley appears exactly as he did in life, except in a kind of ghostly, fantastical fashion. The other big difference about Marley, we are told, is that clasped about his middle is a chain. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. And of course this chain is a vital symbol in the novel. It represents the way in which Marley is imprisoned by the crimes he committed when alive. And whilst those crimes might not be literal in the sense they would have sent him to prison, he hasn't stolen or murdered, they are crimes of greed and materialism, which is why they are made up. The chain of cash boxes, keys, ledgers, purses, all items we associate with money. And Dickens therefore emphasises that it was Marley's avarice, his miserly ways, that have now entrapped him after life. It is his failure to be generous, to look after his fellow man, that now condemns him. And of course, these are the same crimes that Scrooge is guilty of, although at this point he fails to see or acknowledge that. The other inhuman aspect of Marley's ghost is, of course, his transparency. We're told he is a phantom. He has no bowels. There is something death cold about his eyes. He is zapped of life entirely. And he then demands that Scrooge should ask me who I was. And the use of the past tense there being very telling, because it reminds us of his dead state. He is no longer living. He no longer exists in the present, if you will. And Scrooge tries to take a pragmatic approach, even at this point, even with the ghost right in front of him. He asks him to sit down, almost as if he were a friend or acquaintance coming over for a cup of tea, as opposed to an apparition who has appeared from nowhere clanking his chain. And then he insists that perhaps it is a slight disorder of the stomach that is causing him to hallucinate in the manner you might do if you had, say, a fever. He even tries to make a joke of the whole situation. There's more of gravy than of grave about you. So trying to dismiss it, trying to make light of what is happening to him, but obviously failing to do so. And all the descriptions that Dickens uses are intended to be frightening. They are intended to create the impression that this is a rather macabre, gloomy presence who has entered Scrooge's room. And do bear in mind that first description that Dickens gave us, that he intended to create a ghostly tale. So he describes how his eyes are fixed and glazed. There is something awful about him. He comes with an infernal presence. He is perfectly motionless, not something one would expect of a living being. And most chillingly, his skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapour from an oven, again perhaps suggesting there is some connection here between Marley and hell. He is now existing in a kind of purgatory, a kind of tortuous state. He has not gone to heaven or any other kind of Elysian place. He remains in this world suffering for what he has done whilst alive. And while Scrooge tries to dismiss all of this, even shouting once more, "Humbug, I tell you, humbug," Marley's response seems ever more desperate. He lets out a frightful cry and shook its chains with such a dismal and appalling noise. And these sounds that seem to only increase with the progress of this chapter are intended not only to convey the ghost's anguish, his pain, because he is in a state of suffering, but they're also intended to shock and frighten Scrooge. And Marley wants to shock and frighten him in order to force him to change his ways. We're then told he removes the bandage and its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast, a quite grotesque detail that adds to the sense of this being a rather dark, macabre moment. And it's interesting to note how many times Dickens uses the pronoun it or its, not him. Again, perhaps emphasising that Marley is not alive. He is no longer human. He has lost the ability to interact with humans, which is in fact part of his punishment. And he then explains really why he has come and why he is suffering as he is now. He tells Scrooge that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, oh woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turned to happiness. So he is pointing out his own crimes, his own failures. When he was alive, much like Scrooge, he confined himself to the world of money, and he was only concerned with selfish gain. He not only had no interaction with people and therefore no joy in them, but also he failed to help them. He failed to share his wealth or indeed his presence with anybody else. And as a result, he now has to suffer. He says, I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. So he accepts responsibility for what he has done. He chose that life of his own free will and now must be punished for it in the same way. And you'll notice how many words Dickens uses that are to do with imprisonment. Things such as fettered, the image of the chains, even terms like doomed and condemned suggest somebody who is completely entrapped by their past crimes. And what is most frightening perhaps for Scrooge is that Marley tells him the chain he has created over the course of his life is far weightier than his own, because he has lived that much longer and continued to pursue that materialistic, avaricious lifestyle. He says, the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself, it was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have laboured on it since. It is a ponderous chain. And in the description, you've got lots of language from the lexical field of weight. So weight, bear, heavy, ponderous. All terms suggest that the burden that Scrooge will bear after he dies will be even greater, his chain even heavier than the one that Marley bears, because of the length of time he has continued to forge it. And that image of the strong coil is particularly interesting. It suggests something serpentine, snake-like, thereby linking the chain very explicitly with sin. Scrooge lacks the imagination really to understand what Marley is saying at this point. We're told he could see nothing because, of course, the image is metaphorical. Scrooge is not yet wearing it, he is not yet dead. And he says, speak comfort to me, Jacob. The imperative suggesting a rather pathetic, desperate desire to escape this fate, but also showing Scrooge's utter selfishness. He shows no real concern for his partner. He does not ask about his suffering. His only concern, his primary concern, is for himself. And understandably, Marley, therefore, is rather dismissive. He says, a very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere, where the repetition again seems to emphasise the eternal nature of his suffering. That means he is always in a state of restless movement, wandering anxiety, a bit like a spirit in purgatory. He says, my spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me. In life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. So the sense that he confined himself in life and now regards the way he behaved in a rather negative fashion. He calls it a money-changing hole. And now must suffer for that, the incessant torture of remorse. So his suffering is not merely a physical one. I mean, it can't entirely be physical, given the fact that he is now merely a spirit. It is far more emotional and spiritual. He's suffering for his moral crimes. The ghost then sends up another cry and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence. He cries out, captive, bound, double ironed. Again, terms associated with imprisonment. He talks about the incessant labour that he undertook and must undertake, and not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one life's opportunities misused. And that's the important message he has. You cannot, once you are gone, undo the terrible damage that you have done in life. He missed his opportunities, he did not live his life well, and now he cannot change that. Despite this, Scrooge simply says, but you were always a good man of business, as if that still to Scrooge is the most important thing, which seems to frustrate the spirit even more. He wrings his hands. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance and benevolence were all my business. So he is now focusing on what would be considered, I suppose, virtues, particularly Victorian virtues, showing understanding, goodness, morality, giving to others, charity, being kind to others, mercy and understanding of others. All things that he failed, and we've already seen Scrooge fail to demonstrate earlier in the chapter. He goes on to say, why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me? So the sense that he has failed to keep the Christmas spirit during his life. He has failed to help his fellow man, and now can do little about that. His one penance, I suppose, his one hope of doing something good is this appearance to Scrooge. He says this is his chance and hope of escaping my fate. So this is a very noble, generous act by Marley in many regards, perhaps compensating for the way he failed and sinned when he was alive. He is giving Scrooge the opportunity to repent, to change his ways, to escape the same confinement that he is now suffering in spirit form. And he tells Scrooge, you will be haunted by 3 spirits. So Marley also has a really important plot function, because he is introducing really the events of the next 3 chapters, the visitation by the 3 spirits that will eventually come to change Scrooge. Scrooge, who is still utterly self-absorbed and reluctant to change, simply says, I think I'd rather not. He doesn't see the value in what Marley is offering him at all. And when Marley then explains that one will come tomorrow when the bell tolls 1, the second on the next night the same hour, and the third at the last stroke of 12 on the third night, he simply says, couldn't I take them all at once and have it over? So still not seeing the value of what he's being offered, or the need to see each spirit individually, and that they will offer him something very different. Marley, of course, is increasingly desperate. He only has a limited time with Scrooge. There is a sense that he is controlled by some higher power. He therefore wraps his bandage back around his head, stands up and beckons Scrooge towards the window so that he can see the spectral vision of other phantoms wandering hither and thither in restless haste and moaning. And really, the sound effects have been building all the way through the second half of this chapter, reach a kind of climax at this point. Dickens describes confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge. So all of these discordant sounds have 2 effects, really. Firstly, they create this ghostly, haunting atmosphere. And secondly, they highlight the anguish and suffering of these restless spirits, and therefore the fate that Scrooge will face should he not change over the next 3 nights. And it is not that Marley and Scrooge are unique, it's important to note. The air is actually filled with phantoms wandering hither and thither. They are numerous. We don't know how many, but they are numerous. And Dickens seems to be suggesting, therefore, that the message he is offering us in this novel is not for 1 or 2 unique individuals, but is for everybody, because we could all at times be more charitable, benevolent, merciful, generous, kind. And this is therefore our opportunity, particularly at Christmas time, when the story was published, to make those changes and perhaps display those qualities. What is also interesting is that whilst they all wore chains like Marley, some of them were linked together, and the narrator speculates they might be guilty governments. A kind of subtle political criticism by Dickens there, suggesting that it's not just individuals at fault, it's also corrupt governments who fail to help individuals who are suffering or impoverished. And Dickens was very critical of the government, bearing in mind that the Victorian age, this is an era when there was no NHS, there was no free education, there was no benefit system. People were expected to manage and struggle for themselves, and there was little help or support for people who were poor or sick or mentally ill or too young to work for themselves. There was very little hope for those individuals, and so Dickens is criticising the way in which the government failed them too. Dickens even recognises one individual who has a monstrous iron safe attached to his ankle, and again it's particularly this sin, the crime of greed, that is being condemned. He says the misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever. Only now do they realise what they could have done, how they could have helped, but ultimately failed to do during their life. And their suffering now is witnessing others enduring pain, but being unable to intervene. And then finally, the mist enshrouds these spectral figures and they disappear. Scrooge then returns to inside the room, and we get an inkling that he may be beginning to change when we're told he tried to say humbug but stopped at the first syllable. So perhaps just suggesting that seeds of doubt have been planted by Marley, and Scrooge is beginning to reconsider, although he is a long way off from the transformation we eventually see at the end of the novel. And finally Scrooge went straight to bed without undressing and fell asleep upon the instant, which seems to emphasise the impact that Marley's ghost has had on him. And again, in some ways, despite the rather macabre and haunting events of this chapter, we are left with some element of hope. Perhaps Scrooge will change, perhaps he will indeed escape the fate that Marley continues to endure.